Hello, everyone, and good evening to the seventh Karwaan Distinguished Lecture. And today I am honored and delighted to have one of the leading historians of our time, Professor Kesavan Veluthat, sir, among us to deliver this lecture. Professor Kesavan Veluthat is one of the most important historians of pre-colonial South India from his generation. He is best known for his studies on the Brahmana settlements in Kerala and political structure in early medieval South India. Besides earning recognition as the theorist of South India's early medieval epoch, he taught at a couple of colleges before joining the Department of History at Mangalore University, where he taught from 1982 to 2008. He joined the Delhi University as Professor of History in 2009, from where he retired in 2016. Professor Veluthat has been a visiting professor at various universities in India as well as in abroad, and he's currently handling the heading the Institute for the Study of the Heritage of Coastal Kerala in Kodungallur, and in the course of his illustrious career for 4 decades, Professor Veluthat has published over 18 books in Malayalam and English, including 2 monographs and 3 collections of essays. Professor Veluthat's first major landmark was in 1978 when he published a paper with Professor M.G.S. Narayanan on the Vaishnava Alvar and Shaiva Nayanar Bhakti movements in South India. His one of the most significant work is the political structure of early medieval South India, which was based on his PhD thesis. So, without further ado, I would request Professor Veluthat to continue with his lecture titled Social Formations in Early South India. Over to you, sir.
Uh, Thank you, Ishan. Thank you for those extremely nice words. It's always interesting to hear nice things about oneself, even if they are a little exaggerated. Let me first of all place on record my appreciation for this initiative uh, taken up by my friends in Delhi University, bringing together scholars, asking them to talk about the area where they have specialized, etc., particularly in the extremely troubled time in which we are living, where communication is extremely limited. I also thank my friends for the opportunity they have given me, particularly for including me in a most illustrious company, as you must have noticed from the title of the lecture. This is one of the distinguished lectures that they have been organizing. So, thank you very much for asking me to be part of this. As Mr. Sharma said, I am asked to speak on social formations in early South India. Social formations in the plural, which by implication suggests that I am not going to speak about a monolithic, unchanging kind of thing. And there is particularly kind of uneven development that you have across space and over time. So, recognition of this uneven character of the development of historical processes in South India is perhaps one of the most important things that I want to underline. By South India, I think I must also make my point clear. By South India, I mean the land which is described in the texts as lying between Venkatam, that is Tirupati, and Kanyakumari, that is the present day states of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Pondicherry. Now, in relation to this area, we have a homogeneity in terms of the archaeological cultures. We have also a homogeneity in terms of the literary cultures, literary production in the early periods with which we are concerned here. At the same time, we can also see a distinction between this part of South India and further north, say, for example, between the Kannada and Telugu speaking regions of the rest of South India. Uh, this is the spatial limits with which I will be concerned today. Uh, I'll also say a thing or two about the temporal limits. The time frame that I have taken up is roughly from about the 3rd century BCE, when South India enters the historical phase. From the prehistoric period to the historical period, when literary sources in the form of oral poetry, in the form of inscriptions, that is, cave labels and such like inscriptions, in the form of coins with legends, etc., are available. So the beginning of literary sources marks the beginning of history. And from the period when history begins to the next stage, when we can see a visible change in the nature of the social formation. That is a kind of a transition from one period or one phase to another phase that is roughly about 1,000 years. Exact dates are not available. Roughly about 1,000 years after this arrival of the historical period. So this is the spatio-temporal limits within which I will be speaking this afternoon. When we are speaking about this period, the history of South India in this period, naturally it will be useful to begin with a very, very brief discussion of the historiography of this period. When, for example, in the 19th century, historical writing began in this part along modern lines, so to say. The most important obsession that historians had was, when did South India get Aryanized? When did the migration of Aryans to South India takes place? To begin with, for example, in the beginning of the 19th century, everybody was under the spell of the influence of Henry Holbrook, who believed that all Indian languages are derivatives of Sanskrit, that is, of the Indo Aryan family. It was in the middle of the 19th century that Ellis suggested that this is not so. Some of the languages of South India, such as Tamil, Malayalam, Tulu, Telugu, Kannada, etc., have a different structure grammatically, semantically, syntactically, and therefore they have to be looked upon as not sharing stem from the common Aryan roots that Sir William Jones and Henry Holbrook were talking about. Following the work of Ellis, Robert Caldwell wrote his monumental comparative grammar of the Dravidian languages, which established clearly that the Dravidian is a separate family of languages, entirely independent of the Indo Aryan family of languages. This was also the beginning of a kind of a debate as to which is superior. Is Dravidian superior or Aryan superior? And these linguistic terms, those days, were used interchangeably as racial expressions also. So here was an Aryan race, here was a Dravidian race. So was it Dravidian? Was it Aryan? which is superior, which is better. It was this kind of a perennial fight between scholars that you can see. Uh, South India, particularly, was in favor of Dravidian, saying that Dravidian was certainly superior even before the Aryans came to India with their language. The Dravidian language and Dravidian culture and Dravidian race was here in India. Therefore, Dravidian was pre-Aryan, non-Aryan, super-Aryan. This was the kind of argument that these scholars had. It was about the turn of the 20th century that a major heuristic revolution took place in South India with the discovery of what is usually described as the Sangam literature. Of course, there were also other kinds of discoveries, for instance, discovery of inscriptions, etc. I'm not going into that part of it. I'll take up this discovery of the so called Sangam literature. A very illustrious scholar by name Swaminatha Iyer and a few others were towards the end of the 19th century and early in the 20th century coming up with manuscripts of somewhat obscure literary texts in archaic Tamil. And in the commentary of one of these works, there was a reference to a story about an academy of scholars in the city of Madurai and how some of the works listed there were the kind of works that Swaminatha Iyer and others were coming up with. So, this corpus of literature was immediately identified as something of a Sangam literature. So, a whole body of literature, what do I say, a uniform kind of literary corpus was identified as Sangam literature. And no sooner had this been discovered, published, and translated into English, had historical studies based on them begun. One of the earliest works by Kanakasabai, V. Kanakasabai, Tamil's 1800 years ago, was perhaps the first major narrative taking up the question of the Sangam period in South Indian history, where ideas about the three kingdoms of Pandya, Chera, Chola, Roman trade, and others were taken up. This was supplemented by the work of scholars like P.T. Srinivasa Iyengar and K.N. Shivarajapillai. At one level, this was a sober academic exercise that historians were taking. But at another level, based on this, the Tamil pride was further fanned up. The Dravidian Tamil pride was fanned up, which was perhaps even further boosted by the discovery of the Harappan civilization in the 20s of the 20th century, about 100 years ago. Another level at which work was going on was in relation to the so called Roman trade. Now, in the 20th century, particularly when historians, British historians, such as H.G. Rawlinson or M.P. Charles Worth or E.H. Warmington, were working on relations between the Roman Empire on the one side and the Eastern Indian Ocean countries, they were concerned more with the Roman Empire. And as the title of Mortimer Wheeler's famous book suggests, Rome beyond the imperial frontiers was the concern with which these scholars were working. Naturally, when they were writing about South India and South India's trade with the Roman Empire, they were talking as if the Roman Empire was a forerunner of the British Empire. So if there was trade and kind of relationship that was obtaining in the 19th and 20th centuries, this was naturally a continuation of the old Roman trade which the Roman Empire was carrying out. So, if you, for example, look at the titles of these work, Rawlinson wrote his book, Intercourse Between India and the Western World, uh, from the earliest times to the fall of Rome. Or Charles Worth wrote about trade routes and commerce of the Roman Empire. E.H. Warmington wrote about commerce between the Roman Empire and India. And as late as 1904, Sir Mortimer Wheeler wrote about Rome beyond the imperial frontiers. Everywhere, the concern was with the Roman Empire and the way in which the Roman Empire interacted with the rest of the world. Rome being, or the imperial center, being the center of activities. In recent years, however, there has been greater sobriety in the writings of historians. And towards the end of the 20s, Nilakanta Shastri started writing. His Pandyan Kingdom appeared in 1929. In the 1930s, he wrote extensively about the Cholas, first in the form of studies in Chola history and administration. Later, the what is redoubtable monograph on the Cholas. This is what we find, and ever since there has been greater work, particularly as there were also inquiries into the possibility of other sources such as archaeology or numismatics or inscriptions in the 1930s. Subramanya Iyer, for instance, very conclusively identified what is known as the Tamil Brahmi script and was able to read the Tamil Brahmi cave labels from here and there in South India. So, in this way, it was possible by the 40s and 50s to be more sober about historical writing. So the recent work that we have on South India is based on this. That is also based on, apart from this uh, better heuristic resources that they had, there is also the advantage that the recent work is based on greater interdisciplinarity with archaeology, anthropology, folkloristics, text criticism, etc., coming to the help of the historian. For instance, there was this Sri Lankan scholar, K. Kailasapati, who recognized the early Tamil poetry as heroic poetry, as oral poetry. This was a veritable bombshell which fell on the pride of the Tamils. What was celebrated as classical poetry is now described as oral poetry handed down from generation to generation by word of mouth, not literature at all. And the work of Shivatambi, another Sri Lankan scholar, the work of Shivatambi added further to this. He brought to bear upon the study of early Tamil literature and early Tamil society a very clear materialist understanding. He was a Marxist and he brought to bear on his study of early South Indian society a Marxist understanding and some anthropological insights. Again, by the 50s and 60s, a reconsideration of the evidence concerning the Roman and North Indian trade, that is, the archaeological, literary, and numismatic evidence concerning the trade with the Roman Empire, with North India, etc., was possible. So it is this that we have in the current showing with the work of scholars like Professor Champakalakshmi, my own teacher, Professor Rajan Gurukal, and others, not to speak about number of Western scholars like Kamil Swelabil and others. In the current showing, therefore, we have a very interesting situation where a critical social theory is sought to uh, be pressed into the service of the historian in order to access the data related to the past. The sources are there, but critically reading the sources with the help of these the insights from these disciplines helped historians in understanding things with greater clarity. One of the things that helped them was to realize the analytical potential of a text called Tolkapiam. Tolkapiam is actually a text on grammar, prosody, and poetics, which is supposed to be part of the so-called body of Sangam literature. In fact, many believed that Tolkapiam prescribed how to write poetry, and all the poets of included of the all the poets of the academy wrote poetry accordingly, and we have what is called Sangam literature. Now, anybody can understand that this is not the way in which things work. First, we have the literary texts, the poetry, and based on that, a kind of a deductive, descriptive study of the grammar, of the prosody, of the poetics, etc., is formed. That is what we see here. So this text called Tolkapiam has very great analytical potential. It can help the historian in understanding society in a big way. Tolkapiam classifies the entire poetry into two categories. One is what is known as aham as they pronounce in Tamil, and puram. Aham means interior, and puram means exterior. Uh, Obviously, the subject matter of aham poetry is the sentiments that you have inside you related to love, for example, tender affection, etc. And the subject matter of puram is things that are exterior to you, such as war, diplomacy, political relations, etc. There is a further classification of these poems, that is, Aham poetry on the one side and Puram poetry on the other, as into what are known as Thinais. Thinai is actually a poetic device with the help of which they understood situations of poetry. In much of the writings that we have in recent years, there is an oversimplification. There is an oversimplification as if Trinai stood for the physiographic division of South India. So South India is divided into 5 parts, each of which was known as a Trinai, and each had its own peculiar features. This is the way in which a very, very simplified picture of the Trinai concept in Tulhapiyam is given. I think one has to look at it more closely in a more nuanced way in order to understand that this is not exactly the case. As I was saying earlier, Tolkapium is basically a text of poetry, poetics, grammar, and prosody. So we have to understand it basically as discussing situations of poetry, situations of versification, etc. In Tamil poetics, Tinai is a type of poetical mode or theme. So basically, this has to be understood as a situation of poetry, a poetical mode, or a theme. A Tinai consists of a complete poetical landscape. So it's not just physiographical landscape, it is a poetical landscape. So a definite time for each Tinai, a defined place, season in which the poem is set, the background elements characteristic of that landscape, including the flora and the fauna, its inhabitants, the deities worshipped there, and the way in which society is organized within that landscape. These collectively provide the imagery for extended poetic metaphors, which set the mode of the poem. Poets recognized, as I said earlier, two broad categories of Tanais. We have Agam Tanais, that is, the genre related to Agam or the interior, which consisted of modes used in love poetry associated with specific aspects of a relationship or specific stages in the development of a relationship. Puram Tanais, that is, Tanais related to Puram poetry or poetry of the exterior, consisted of modes that corresponded closely to the Agam modes but were used in heroic, philosophical, and moral poetry to describe stages in a battle or particular patterns of thought. For our purpose, for purposes of understanding society, the ahamtanis will be more useful. These ahamtanis, now this is well known. There are 5 of them. Uh, Kurinji, which is the hilly or mountainous region, Palai or parched or dry land, Mullai or the pastoral tract, Marudam or the river valleys or agrarian tracts, and Neither or the littoral. There are many nuances of the poetic convention, but one can make certain broad generalizations. Kurinji, the subject of poems in the Kurinji Tinai, are usually the secret meeting of lovers. The time when it happens is daytime or midnight. Lovers' union is the main sentiment in Kurinji. In Pali, the hero sets out across the wilderness to elope with his beloved. Occasionally, the hero is married and undertakes the journey for business purposes or for some good. The time is midday and the season is summer. Separation is the theme of Pali. So, lovers' union in Kurinji separation in Pali. In Mullai, the heroine waits for her man to return from a journey. Rainy season is the period, and the time is usually evening. Patient waiting is the theme of Mullai. Neither the subject is often separation, and it is characterized by anxious waiting. The time is afternoon, evening, or occasionally night. Rainy season is the period. Finally, we have what is known as Marudam, which is the fertile river valleys, agrarian tracts. After a marriage, and usually after the couple have a child, the hero leaves his wife and begins to live with courtesans. The time is day. Lovers' infidelity and the beloved's resentment are the themes in Marida. Now, I know that I have taken up a little more time than necessary in order to dilate on the nature of the Tinai concept. This was necessary because of a wide ranging misunderstanding that Tinai is all about the physiographic division of South India, and within this, about the way in which livelihood is there. I don't mean to say that it is less important, but that is not what Tanai is about. What we get about the physiographical division, about the nature of livelihood, about the modes of subsistence in these are incidental things. And what we get incidentally is certainly important. Now we will come to that. Of the five Tanais, one is about people who lived of hunting and gathering. That is Kurinji Thunai. Now we saw that Kurinji Thunai is about the pastures, about the hills and forests. So in the hills and forests, the livelihood is hunting and gathering. They were fighters known as Kuravar, that is, hunters, Kuravar, and they worshipped a deity who later gets identified into Murugan or Subramanian. The Marudam Tanai that we spoke of, the Mullai Tanai that we spoke about, is the pastures and jungles. The livelihood naturally is cattle keeping, cow herding, or sheep herding, and there they lived by keeping this. They worshipped a deity appropriate to that, known as Mayon. No, sorry, Mayon, the black one, a bucolic deity who later gets identified with Krishna of the Indian Puranic themes. The third one is the Pali Tanai, parched land, a desert like situation where people, there is no cultivation possible, there is no hunting and gathering possible, there is no pastoralism possible. So they lived by plunder and a fear, worshipped a fierce, warlike goddess, Kottayam, in that. A fishing and salt manufacture was the mode of subsistence. In the fifth Tinai, that is Neithan, which is the coastal tract, they naturally worshipped the sea god Kadalam. So, of these five Tinais, we can see that only a fifth, namely the Marudam Tinai, was engaged in agriculture, however primitive that agriculture was. A corresponding picture is given by archaeology. The archaeology of megaliths, for example, where we have evidence of the use of iron implements, but not much of agricultural implements. You don't have iron plowshares. You don't have agricultural implements. So there is a marked bias towards implements of aggression or implements like axes, answers, daggers, arrowheads, etc., and less about the agricultural implements. So, in such a situation where the majority of people lived by food gathering, hunting and gathering, or fishing, or cattle keeping, or plundering, where majority of the people lived of food gathering, and only a section lived by agriculture in the Marizam Tadei, naturally, no surplus worthy name can be expected. There was no surplus that was produced worth the name. And when there is no surplus, naturally there is no unequal distribution of surplus. When there is no unequal distribution of surplus, there is no differentiation of society in any marked manner, certainly not on the basis of unequal possession of resources, unequal command of resources. That means that society in South India in this period was a relatively undifferentiated. I don't mean to say that it was an entirely egalitarian kind of society, a relatively undifferentiated kind of society. Undifferentiated kind of society. Now, it is here that we have to recognize a very, very important problem. The problem of what is known as the Roman trade. Historians in the past, I was telling you about the work of Kanakasabhai. Kanakasabhai, for example, waxed eloquent about the very rich evidence of Roman trade. So here is Roman coin in their headloads available from different parts of South India. Here is Roman pottery. Here is the graphic description of Roman trade in the Greco-Roman classical accounts. There was this what was debate in the Roman Senate about the way in which Roman wealth was draining as a result of the trade in Oriental luxuries. The Senate even chastised the people for going for this kind of trade. So, historians, particularly in the beginning of the 20th century, waxed eloquent about this great trade that South India had with Roman Empire. South India was rubbing shoulders with perhaps the epitome of the civilized world at that time, the Roman Empire. And that too, the balance of trade was in favor of South India, not in favor of Rome. So, how do we fit in this evidence of Roman trade into the picture that we have just now seen about a society which did not produce any considerable surplus, which did not have any marked differentiation within society? Where do we place this? How do we explain this? This was a problem. But when we look at the evidence more closely, evidence of the so-called Roman trade more closely, we can see that there isn't much that we have to worry about. For one thing, what were the items of trade? The people from the West, it's actually from West Asia, not Rome. It is from West Asia and Egypt. People from the Western region came to South India, gathered the wild products of South India. The list of items that were traded is available in the literature. We have a considerable amount of pepper. We have aloe wood. Occasionally a peacock is taken. Occasionally a monkey is exported. So all this are wild products, not the result of any activity of production, not certainly a surplus that is produced. And what was brought in? The evidence that we have is it is gold that came in. Gold coins, of course, gold coins that came in. But were they used as coins? That is the question that we have to ask. It's very questionable. In the entire body of literature that we are talking about as Sangam literature, there is no evidence of a single coin being used as a medium of exchange. No coin is described as a measure of value. It is not a unit of payment at all. So it is not money. Now, by the definition of money that we have studied in our undergraduate classes in economics, none of these qualities, none of these features of money we have in these metallic pieces that the Romans brought in. It was at best a prestige item. A prestige item which can be flaunted on your person, which can be gifted away, and evidence of these being flaunted on your person is available also. In the coins that are discovered in the hoards, in Kerala there are a few hoards, there are hoards in other parts also. In many of them, we have a hole at the edge of these coins, which shows that either necklaces were made of these, or at least one piece was used as a pendant. So it is not money, it is only an item of prestige that we have. It is not money since you don't have any evidence of exchange. There is no statement about coin being a mediator in any of these exchanges. And another thing in the numismatic evidence itself is that there is very little evidence of wear and tear. Many of these coins are as if they are fresh from the mint. When they are fresh from the mint, naturally it means that there was very little wear and tear, there was very little transaction. Naturally, what kind of transaction? Now, if it is not used as coin, if it is not used as a medium of exchange for purchasing goods and services, naturally there will not be any exchange. And when there is no exchange, there will not be wear and tear. So it was uh, a goods for goods exchange, this being a prestige item. The goods that were accepted by South Indians were prestige items, what anthropologists call items of idiotechnic value, not intrinsic value. In this society, the economic and social activities revolved around the family, the units of social economic activity. It was the labor that is available from within the family. Now, whether you are cattle keeping, whether you are hunting and gathering, whatever labor is available within your family is sufficient for such activities of production as was undertaken within that family. So the households or kutis were the units of economic and social organization. A few kutis largely defined by the geographical location in which these households were located. A few kutis together constituted a kinship group called Ur, which is translated in modern Tamil as a village. Headmen of these groups, that is, these kinship groups called Ur, known as Kidar. Kidar literally is from Kidavan, the old man, or one who has control. Either way, actually it is the same. That is on the basis of seniority of age, that within a family and within a kinship group, the senior most person becomes the man with control. We have Kudis thus as the basic unit of social and economic organization, and these units of social and economic organization, they sometimes a few of them together came together, a few of them came together and formed larger groups. So some of these Kirans graduated into bigger Kirans who came to be known as Whale or a chief, and still bigger ones were known as Vendan, which is translated as king. So it was generally the chiefdom level organization that we can see in relation to the exercise of power and control within that society. There is no evidence of the institution of state. Now, earlier historians wrote about the Pandyan kingdom, the first empire of the Pandyan kingdom. They wrote about the Chola empire. They wrote about the Jairas. They wrote about the minor kings, the major kings, etc. But this was before the recognition of the possibility of a pre-state, non-state situation in historical societies. Now it is largely recognized that South India in this period was a pre-state society where power and control were uh, generally at a chiefdom level organization. Those who were closer to the chiefs had some privileges. Those who were not as close had fewer privileges. So, this is the kind of stratification that you can see, not on the basis of unequal distribution of wealth or unequal access to resources. So it is this that we can see with family as the basic unit of social and economic organization, labor available within the family only alone being used for such activities of production as were happening, etc. It is from this that we can look for passages to or possible passages to a later formation. When we come to about the 7th century or 8th century, we start getting a different set of sources, different kinds of sources. We have now very lengthy inscriptions, unlike the cave labels that we have, perhaps two lines, at best one sentence. That kind of short labels and notices give way to very lengthy inscriptions, granting land, recording the achievements of kings and kingdoms, etc. We have very elaborate court literature, which is evidence of a literate literature in the place of the oral literature that we have in the earlier period. We have monumental architecture in the form of huge temples in the place of the paltry megaliths that we have in an earlier period, the court and temple literature. So when we have these different sets of sources, sources of a different nature, naturally it means that society which produced these sources is a different kind of society. And it's not the old society, it is a different kind of society that produced these new kind of sources. So what happened to society? How did a change from the old society, a hand-to-mouth existence with very little surplus that is produced, from that to another society where there is considerable production of surplus, where there is unequal distribution of surplus, and the surplus being siphoned down to have these monumental architecture and other statements of ours for the monarchical state that has come up. So, the question that one would like to raise is what was the factor behind this transformation, this great transformation, as Karpalani has used this expression, this great transformation? What were the factors behind this grand or great transformation? One major item that we can see is that the old forms of production, the old forces of production and distribution were becoming obsolete as time passes. For instance, I was talking about technology, iron technology. Iron was known, and few implements of iron, very few implements of iron for purposes of agriculture was being used. But things were changing. Similarly, we see that in the poetry, there are statements where poets are rewarded. Munificent gifts are given to poets who sang the praise of these chieftains. We were talking about the entire kind of chieftains. And songs were sung about these chieftains, praising them, which formed the apparatus of their legitimation. They were given rewards, and in many cases, the reward that was given was land. Another way in which land was given, another reason for which land was given was for the performance of sacrifices. We see Vedic Brahmins from northern India coming and cajoling these chieftains to perform sacrifices for their longevity, for their greatness, etc. And they get the sacrifices performed, and at the end of the day, the Brahmin priests get their fees. In one case, there is a reference that for the performance of a sacrifice, 72,000 villages were given as dakshina or sacrificial fee. Now, one doesn't have to take this figure very seriously, but land was suddenly given as fee for the performance of sacrifices. Soldiers are given land as a reward for joining the chief in plundering raids. So, in this way, soldiers, poets, priests, when they were given land, naturally it involved working in this land. A soldier doesn't work in the land, a poet doesn't work in the land, a priest doesn't work in the land. Naturally, therefore, extra family labor becomes necessary for working in this land. So, a major shift from family labor to extra family labor comes in when larger areas of land are brought under cultivation, when a huge labor force, particularly in the form of extra family labor is brought, naturally there is surplus that is produced. And from out of this surplus that is produced, it is possible to reward the people who took part in the process of production. So surplus that is produced is distributed and uh, naturally unequally. So a wedge is driven within society. The extra family labor, to begin with, one doesn't understand the significance. But as it goes down deeper and deeper, it erodes the whole system. The old social formation gave way to a new social formation represented by the agrarian expansion, represented by huge land grants to brahmanas and temples, the rise of temples as a monument, the stratification of society, particularly with the acceptance of the ideology of Varnashrama Dharma, and above all, a society which now required the institution of state. So we have the arrival of the state in the form of the state presided over by the Pallavas in northern Tamil Nadu, or the Pandyas in southern Tamil Nadu, or the Cheras on the west coast in what is now Kerala, or the Cholas slightly later in the Kaveri Valley. And then their graduation into an empire, particularly that of the Cholas, into an empire. So, a different kind of society replaces the old social formation characterized by the Tenai frame that we have in the Tulhapir. So it is this way that the present understanding of South India or South India's early historical past goes. I know that I haven't been able to do justice, but to do it in 1 hour so is a very difficult task, and therefore I had to limit. Anyway, thank you for your patience. Thank you for the patient listening.
Thank you very much, sir, for this wonderful and very illustrious lecture. And we really appreciate and really respect you for taking out time from your busy schedule for this lecture. There are two or three questions, sir, and if you can answer those. The first question is, do you subscribe to the view that Tolkappiyam is very close to Panini's grammar, just as Vara Ruchi's work on Prakrit languages?
No, the certainly the author of Tolhapiyam knew Panini's grammar, but the grammatical structure that we have in Tolhapiyam is different from the grammatical structure that Panini follows. For example, now if you permit me to elaborate a little,
Surely.
The idea of Pratyahara Sutras that you have in Panini, you don't have in Tolhapiyam at all. Tolhapiyam describes language in two ways. You have three ways. You have the Shuladhigaram, the Elutadhigaram, and the Puruladhigaram. That is the speech, the writing, and the meaning. So it is the way in which he describes, Tolhappier describes language is different from the way in which Panini does it. Of course, Tolhappier knew Panini, but deviated from Panini in a big way.
So another question is, did Cawdies play any monetary role in ancient South India?
Beg your pardon?
Did Cawdies play any monetary role in early South India or ancient South India?
No, not in this period. Not in this period. We don't have any evidence of the use of Kaudi shells as a medium of exchange. The reason is very simple. The idea of splitting exchange into buying and selling, where there is the necessity of a medium, coin, whatever kind of coin, whether it is metallic coin or a cowrie shell, that
Yes.
did not exist because it hadn't, exchange in South India had not graduated from the level of barter. It's only after exchange graduates from the level of barter that we require a medium, whether it is metallic money or cowrie shells.
Yes, sir. Sir, this is a question from Ashwin Vijay, and his question is: could you shed some light on the early political authority in Kerala in connection with the control of maritime trade in the spice routes?
Now, even here there is this problem. When we are speaking about politics, the maritime trade, we assume that there was a trade of an equal kind of relationship. Roman Empire on the one side and Kerala on the other, rubbing shoulders with one another. This is not the situation. If you look at the items that the traders from the Roman world, now I told you it was West Asia, not Roman world, and the West Asian traders took away. These were wild products which did not require any kind of political authority. Anybody can go to the forest and collect them, whether it is pepper, and you can catch a peacock from the forest, you can catch a monkey from the peacock, and this is what the Romans had use for. So far as the Romans are concerned, these are articles of trade. They are buying it by paying money. But what South Indians received was not money. It was only so many pieces of metal, prestige items. So that distinction we have to make. And when we make this distinction, the question of political authority controlling, regulating trade, etc., that becomes irrelevant. We don't have any evidence except that we have references to the chiefs called cheras who were no better than the kind of chiefs in a chiefdom level organization. And that too, the cheras were mostly in Tamil Nadu, in the Coimbatore, Tiruchirappalli, Salem districts of modern Tamil Nadu, and also parts of present-day Kerala in the Thrissur, Palakkad, and perhaps Malappuram districts of Kerala. That's all.
So this question might be a little debatable. It is from Suman Prasad, and the question is: I have read that the Tamil Brahmi script found during the archaeological excavations at Kezhadi is remarkably similar to the Indus Valley script. My question is: do you believe that the Dravidian culture is a remnant of the Indus Valley culture?
Well, this is, as you said, it's less debatable than difficult because there are scholars who very seriously believe that Harappan civilization had elements. For example, in the Afghanistan region, there is still this Dravidian language, Brahui, which is still being spoken by a very small section of population. You have many elements there. But Harappan script looking like Tamil or South Indian script, that is unacceptable because the modern scripts in India, whether it is Tamil or Malayalam or Telugu or Kannada, all of them are derived from Brahmi and it has nothing to do with the Harappan script. Now, the
So
other
this question,
idea, no, I'm sorry, and then the other idea that the elements of Dravidian are present in the Harappan culture, that has been there. There are attempts by scholars to read an earlier form of Tamil into what is written by means of the Harappan script and elements of the cultural vestiges of Harappan civilization are thought to be seen in South India. This is apart from what I said.
So this question is from Harsha Vardhan Eluri. His question is, can you correlate early Sangam cultural geography to the contemporary megalithic culture? And when did the Jati proliferation happen in South India?
These are two different questions. That is, the correlation between megalithic archaeology and Sangam literature. Yes, my answer is a very, very clear yes to that. The megalithic archaeology, I will go to the extent of saying, is the material representation of the culture depicted in the early Tamil literature. So I will agree with that. Jati, when does Jati proliferate in South India? This is a good question. And when you compliment a question, saying that it's a good question means that it's a question very difficult to answer. Now, what you have is we have evidence of the presence of jati from the 7th century, 8th century onwards, when we start getting literary texts of the Bhakti movement, that is the Vaishnava, Shaiva, Alvar, Nayana literature. We have references to jatis in the temple inscriptions from the 8th century onwards. But the process of the proliferation of jatis, that is, the increase into large numbers and the creation of division, fusion, etc., proliferation, etc., this must have happened in a slightly later period with a larger number of occupations coming into existence, occupational groups being identified as so many endogamous kinship groups. These endogamous kinship groups now being described as a particular jati, etc. This is the result of a later development. Perhaps it had to wait until the decline of the Chola Empire by, say, the 13th century. By the time we come to Vijayanagara in the 15th century, we see that there is this jati, the proliferation of jati, a large number of them arriving without any doubt.
Sir, what do the recent Arikamedu excavations contribute to our understanding of history?
Now this is now we have evidence of the Roman present. Now, there wasn't any recent excavation. It was only in the 60s that we had the excavation. Recently, there was no excavation at Erikamedu. But what it tells us is about the presence of Roman pottery. You have two kinds of pottery, what is known as the Aretine ware or terra sigillata in Italian, to speak about that, and also the amphora. This Aretine ware is a deluxe ware which only very few people could afford, and amphora were huge jars in which wine and such olive oil, wine, etc., were stored. So this shows also the presence of people influenced heavily by Roman culture, if not Romans themselves physically. And you have to read it together with literature. Literature, particularly classical literature in the Greco-Roman accounts, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, or accounts of Ptolemy, or accounts of Pliny.
We'll take two more questions, sir. This is from Pintu Das. His question is, would you please shed a little light on the pre-3rd century BCE economy and culture in South India? because we have a historical account of Aryans in India in that period. How was the South Indian culture and economy at that time?
Uh, no, what we have in this period, as I was saying in the beginning, we have to depend exclusively on archaeological evidence. So this is the kind of economy that we have in the Neolithic horizon. In the Neolithic horizon, with the arrival of iron represented in the megaliths. So we have the Iron Age megalithic complex. Uh, what do you say? You have the Iron Age megalithic horizon superimposed over the Stone Age horizon. So we cannot say anything meaningfully in historical language. It is the prehistoric kind of discipline and a prehistoric kind of strategy that is necessary to access that part of South India's past.
So this question is from Prabhakar Satpute. His question is how Brahmanization took place in South India sometime after the 8th century CE that caused ouster of Buddhism and Jainism. And he's referring to a book by S.N. Sadashivan, a social history of India. Do you agree with the observations of Sadashivan in the said book?
I'm sorry, I haven't read Sadashivan's book, so I'll not be able to respond to Sadashivan's argument. But the process of the migration of Brahmins to South India is well documented in the inscriptions where gradually a Brahmin settlement is created, a land is given. So the process of migration can be charted with the help of these inscriptions. So from the time of the Satavahanas in Deccan, as you come further and further south, we see the Kadambas, we see the Pallavas, then the Pandyas, then the Jairas, Cholas. In this way, gradually we see this process of migration into South India. Since I haven't read Sadashivan's book, I'll not be able to respond to that.
Sir, if you allow, can we take one?
One more, please.
This is from Samana Zafar. Her question is why were the ruling families in early medieval South India adopting the Shiva cult rather than Vaishnava, a trend which became more popular in medieval times?
This is perhaps a misunderstanding that certain historians have created. The Cholas certainly had a bias towards the Shiva cult. That doesn't mean that they ignored Vishnu temples altogether. You have very famous Vishnu temples from that period, we have very important Vishnu temples in this period. Sri Rangam, for example, one of the best examples of Vaishnava temples in South India is Sri Rangam. We have Sri Villikuttur. We have a large number of Vaishnava temples. The sectarian differences between Shaivism and Vaishnavism, they had their origins in this period, but it became so inimical to one another in the later period by the time we come to the Vijayanagara period in the 15th century. Before that, this kind of a sectarian rivalry wasn't there. There were only sectarian differences.
So thank you so much for this wonderful for
Thank
taking
you.
out so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. It was an honor for me to join the company of the illustrious speakers who spoke before me. Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor to host you, and we look forward to having you in future as well.
Okay. So, bye.